It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of day where nothing dramatic should happen. The neighborhood was calm, kids were playing outside, and sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns. Yet for one homeowner, everything was about to change with a single sheet of paper taped to his front door. The letter wasn't just paper. It was a weapon disguised in polite formatting. A demand from the Homeowners Association, signed with the flourish of its president Karen. According to her, his lawn was out of compliance. No details, no explanation. Just a bold red warning and a fine of $500. It didn't make sense. His grass was cut, his hedges trimmed, and his driveway spotless. In fact, compared to some of the homes nearby, his looked almost pristine. But the letter wasn't about fairness. It was about control. Karen had built a reputation in the community for nitpicking the smallest things. From mailbox heights to the shade of curtains visible through windows, people whispered about her at block parties, rolled their eyes when her name came up. But few dared to confront her. The homeowner stood in his yard, looking at the note, scanning for details. But it was vague by design. That was Karen's special to vagueness that gave her authority wiggle room. And now, she wanted $500 for nothing more than her own satisfaction. He considered ignoring it. Tss. But the HOA wasn't the type of organization you could just dismiss. Ignoring the fine would lead to more letters, escalating threats, maybe even legal trouble. That was the trap Karen used to keep people in line. Pay up, stay quiet, and she moved on to her next victim. But this time, something in him snapped. He decided he wouldn't play her game. He'd dig deeper. He'd find out exactly why she was targeting him. And if it turned out to be as baseless as it seemed, he'd fight her every step of the way as the day went on. He walked the neighborhood, looking at other houses. He saw lawns with weeds poking through, driveways with oil stains, and hedges far taller than his. None of them had letters taped to their doors. It was clear now this wasn't about rules. This was personal. The thought ate at him. Why him? He wasn't loud, he didn't throw wild parties, and he always paid his HOA dues on time. But maybe that was the problem. Karen liked control, and people who didn't bend easily were seen as threats. By evening, he had made up his mind. He wouldn't just pay the fine and move on. He would gather evidence. He would prove that Karen was abusing her power. And once he had enough proof, he would bring it to the entire HOA board. That night, he started documenting everything. Photos of his lawn, close-ups of his trimmed hedges, timestamps of his sprinklers running. He even began a logbook, recording every maintenance task he did around the house. He knew it sounded obsessive, but if Karen wanted a battle, it was going to come prepared. The next morning, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This one wasn't taped to the door, but mailed directly. With the same bold red letters screaming final notice, it claimed that if he didn't pay within 10 days, additional fines would be added and legal action might follow. The speed of escalation shocked him. Normally, HOAs sent multiple warnings before a fine reached this level, but Karen wasn't following standard procedure. She was fast-tracking her attack, trying to intimidate him into giving in, instead of fear, though it fueled his determination. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing a pattern of abuse that had probably been going on for years. He began reaching out to neighbors, carefully asking if anyone else had received strange fines or vague warnings. What he learned confirmed his suspicions. One family had been fined for improper trash storage when their bins were neatly lined up at the curb. Another was threatened with penalties for excessive noise, even though their house had been empty during the time in question. Each story was different, but the common thread was Karen's signature at the bottom. The neighbors had stories, but most had paid the fines anyway. They didn't have the time or energy to fight, but he did. And with their testimonies, he could build a case. As the week went on, he compiled a thick folder of evidence. Photos, statements from neighbors, even a copy of the HOA bylaws showing Karen had skipped mandatory warning steps before issuing fines. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was targeting people she didn't like. By Friday, he was ready. He drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, attaching every piece of evidence he had. He knew Karen wouldn't take it lightly, but he didn't care anymore. She had crossed a line. And now it was his turn to push back. When he slipped the packet into the board's mailbox, he felt a surge of relief. But deep down, he also knew the battle had only just begun. Karen wouldn't sit back and let him expose her. She would fight harder, dig deeper, and try to crush him before the board could act. And that's exactly what happened. The very next day, a new letter arrived, this time accusing him of harassment for speaking with neighbors. Karen was escalating again, but she didn't realize that each move only made her case weaker. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And soon, the entire neighborhood would see Karen for who she really was. But before that moment came, there would be more twists, more false accusations, and more games of power. The fight wasn't just about $500 anymore. It was about justice, reputation, and the downfall of an HOA tyrant. As he placed the newest letter into his growing evidence folder, he realized the story was no longer just his. It was the story of every neighbor Karen had ever bullied. And he was ready to tell it. The first strike had been made. The war with Karen was only beginning. It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of day where nothing dramatic should happen. The neighborhood was calm, kids were playing outside, and sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns. Yet for one homeowner, everything was about to change with a single sheet of paper taped to his front door. The letter wasn't just paper. It was a weapon disguised in polite formatting. A demand from the Homeowners Association, signed with the flourish of its president Karen. According to her, his lawn was out of compliance. No details, no explanation. Just a bold red warning and a fine of $500. It didn't make sense. His grass was cut, his hedges trimmed, and his driveway spotless. In fact, compared to some of the homes nearby, his looked almost pristine. But the letter wasn't about fairness. It was about control. Karen had built a reputation in the community for nitpicking the smallest things. From mailbox heights to the shade of curtains visible through windows, people whispered about her at block parties, rolled their eyes when her name came up. But few dared to confront her. The homeowner stood in his yard, looking at the note, scanning for details. But it was vague by design. That was Karen's special vagueness that gave her authority wiggle room. And now, she wanted $500 for nothing more than her own satisfaction. He considered ignoring it. Psst. But the HOA wasn't the type of organization you could just dismiss. Ignoring the fine would lead to more letters, escalating threats, maybe even legal trouble. That was the trap Karen used to keep people in line. Pay up, stay quiet, and she moved on to her next victim. But this time, something in him snapped. He decided he wouldn't play her game. He'd dig deeper. He'd find out exactly why she was targeting him. And if it turned out to be as baseless as it seemed, he'd fight her every step of the way as the day went on. He walked the neighborhood, looking at other houses. He saw lawns with weeds poking through, driveways with oil stains, and hedges far taller than his. None of them had letters taped to their doors. It was clear now this wasn't about rules. This was personal. The thought ate at him. Why him? He wasn't loud, he didn't throw wild parties, and he always paid his HOA dues on time. But maybe that was the problem. Karen liked control, and people who didn't bend easily were seen as threats. By evening, he had made up his mind. He wouldn't just pay the fine and move on. He would gather evidence. He would prove that Karen was abusing her power. And once he had enough proof, he would bring it to the entire HOA board. That night, he started documenting everything. Photos of his lawn, close-ups of his trimmed hedges, timestamps of his sprinklers running. He even began a logbook, recording every maintenance task he did around the house. He knew it sounded obsessive, but if Karen wanted a battle, it was going to come prepared. The next morning, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This one wasn't taped to the door, but mailed directly. With the same bold red letters screaming final notice, it claimed that if he didn't pay within 10 days, additional fines would be added and legal action might follow. The speed of escalation shocked him. Normally, HOAs sent multiple warnings before a fine reached this level, but Karen wasn't following standard procedure. She was fast-tracking her attack. trying to intimidate him into giving in. Instead of fear, though it fueled his determination. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing a pattern of abuse that had probably been going on for years. He began reaching out to neighbors, carefully asking if anyone else had received strange fines or vague warnings. What he learned confirmed his suspicions. One family had been fined for improper trash storage when their bins were neatly lined up at the curb. Another was threatened with penalties for excessive noise, even though their house had been empty during the time in question. Each story was different, but the common thread was Karen's signature at the bottom. The neighbors had stories, but most had paid the fines anyway. They didn't have the time or energy to fight, but he did. And with their testimonies, he could build a case. As the week went on, he compiled a thick folder of evidence. Photos, statements from neighbors, even a copy of the HOA bylaws showing Karen had skipped mandatory warning steps before issuing fines. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was targeting people she didn't like. By Friday, he was ready. He drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, attaching every piece of evidence he had. He knew Karen wouldn't take it lightly, but he didn't care anymore. She had crossed a line. And now it was his turn to push back. When he slipped the packet into the board's mailbox, he felt a surge of relief. But deep down, he also knew the battle had only just begun. Karen wouldn't sit back and let him expose her. She would fight harder, dig deeper, and try to crush him before the board could act. And that's exactly what happened. The very next day, a new letter arrived, this time accusing him of harassment for speaking with neighbors. Karen was escalating again, but she didn't realize that each move only made her case weaker. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And soon, the entire neighborhood would see Karen for who she really was. But before that moment came, there would be more twists, more false accusations, and more games of power. The fight wasn't just about $500 anymore. It was about justice, reputation, and the downfall of an HOA tyrant. As he placed the newest letter into his growing evidence folder, he realized the story was no longer just his. It was the story of every neighbor Karen had ever bullied. And he was ready to tell it. The first strike had been made. The war with Karen was only beginning. The clubhouse lights glowed against the dark night sky as residents filed in, their chatter low and cautious. It wasn't often that Karen called a special meeting, and the unusual urgency had stirred curiosity across the neighborhood. Some came to support her, loyal to the power she wielded. Others came quietly, hoping to see someone finally stand up against her. The room carried an energy that was hard to ignore. Folding chairs scraped against the floor. Neighbors shuffled into rows. The murmur of whispered speculation filled the air. At the front stood Karen, her clipboard stacked with papers, her posture rigid with authority. To the casual eye, she looked composed. But anyone watching closely could see the flicker of tension in her eyes. The homeowner sat 3 rows back, his folder resting firmly in his lap. He didn't scan the room for allies. He didn't need to. His focus was on the board. The group that had the power to determine whether Karen's reign would continue unchecked or finally be challenged. The meeting began with Karen's voice cutting through the room. She recited the agenda, her words framed to make it seem like this gathering was routine. But buried in the list was the item she had been waiting for. Discussion of disruptive homeowner activity. It was vague enough to sound official, but pointed enough that everyone knew exactly who she is. Meant Karen launched into her case with practiced confidence. She laid out her claims in sharp, deliberate sentences. Fines unpaid. Harassment of neighbors. Disregard for community rules. Each point she read from her papers was designed to make the homeowner appear reckless, selfish, and out of control. She spoke with the authority of someone who had done this before, expecting nods of agreement, expecting silence from those who disagreed. But as she spoke, something subtle shifted in the room. The longer she went on, the more her desperation leaked through. She repeated herself. She exaggerated details. Her voice rose slightly with each accusation, as though volume could fill the gaps where evidence was missing. When she finally finished, the room was quiet. For years, Karen had spoken, and the board had nodded. She had built her influence on fear and compliance. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was an agreement. It was hesitation. The board turned to the homeowner, giving him the chance to respond. He stood, unfolding slowly the folder in his hand. His movements were calm, deliberate. He didn't raise his voice or rush his words. Instead, he began with facts. He opened his folder and laid out his evidence, one piece at a time. Photos of his lawn, time-stamped and dated. Maintenance logs showing the care he had taken to follow the rules. Copies of the HOA bylaws highlighting the exact steps Karen had skipped when issuing her fines. Then came the testimonies, written statements from neighbors who had been fined or warned unfairly. Each story reinforcing a pattern of abuse. He didn't embellish. He didn't accuse. He let the evidence speak for itself, and it spoke louder than Karen's claims ever could. As he continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. Neighbors leaned forward in their seats, whispering quietly to each other. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions tightening with unease. For the first time, Karen's authority didn't feel untouchable. Karen tried to interrupt, waving her hand and insisting the evidence was irrelevant. She called the testimonies biased, the photos misleading, the logs fabricated. But her protests only made her look weaker. The homeowner didn't react. He calmly continued, placing each document into the growing pile in front of the board. By the time he finished, the folder was nearly empty, but the table in front of the board was full. Full of proof, full of stories, full of undeniable evidence that Karen had abused her position. The silence that followed was heavy. Karen stood stiff at the front, her hands gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. She expected the board to defend her, to dismiss his evidence and reaffirm her authority, but the hesitation in their eyes told a different story. One of the board members cleared their throat, acknowledging that the accusations were serious and that the evidence couldn't be ignored. Another suggested that a formal review of Karen's actions was necessary. It wasn't an outright condemnation. It was the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. Karen's face flushed. She tried to regain control, insisting that the board shouldn't be distracted, and that this was a matter of discipline against one resident, not an attack on her leadership. But the words fell flat. The narrative she had tried to build was unraveling in front of her. The meeting ended without a resolution. The board promised to review the evidence and reconvene at a later date. It was a temporary pause, a holding of breath before the next move. But the shift was undeniable. For the first time, Karen wasn't in complete control. As neighbors filed out of the clubhouse, the whispers grew louder. Some avoided Karen's eyes, while others glanced knowingly at the homeowner, offering subtle nods of respect. The power dynamic had changed. Even if Karen refused to admit it, the homeowner walked home with the folder back under his arm, feeling the weight of progress. It wasn't victory yet, but it was momentum. The truth had been spoken, and the board could no longer claim ignorance. Karen, however, wasn't finished. That night, as she sat in her home, staring at her clipboard, her thoughts turned darker. She had underestimated him once, but she wouldn't make the same mistake again. If the board wouldn't silence him, she would find another way. And so, while the homeowner celebrated a small win, Karen was already plotting her next move. The battle had shifted. The evidence was on his side. The neighbors were beginning to turn, and the board was starting to question. But Karen wasn't going down quietly. The showdown had only just begun. The next chapter of their conflict would take the fight beyond the clubhouse walls. The meeting had ended, but Karen's fury had only just begun. For years she had ruled the HOA with unchecked power, her clipboard like a scepter, her fines like commands. No one had dared to question her until now. And in her mind, the homeowner's decision to stand up wasn't just defiance, it was betrayal. That night, as she stayed awake long after the neighborhood went quiet, the homeowner's folder of evidence haunted her thoughts. Each photo, each statement, each document felt like a direct attack on the control she had built. She couldn't afford cracks in her authority. She couldn't allow whispers of rebellion to grow into something larger. So she decided on a new strategy: retaliation. If she couldn't silence him with fines or smear him with rumors, she would bury him under an avalanche of accusations. The very next morning, he found not one, but 3 letters stuffed into his mailbox. Each was written in the same cold, official tone, each accusing him of a different violation. The first claimed his trash cans had been left out too long, even though they had been pulled in within the hour of collection. The second accused him of improper landscaping, citing the arrangement of his flower beds. The third alleged that he had hosted an unauthorized gathering in his backyard, an accusation so absurd it was almost laughable. It was obvious what Karen was doing. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was throwing darts in the dark, hoping one would stick, hoping the sheer weight of paperwork would break him down. But instead of fear, he felt something else. Clarity. Karen was exposing herself with every false claim. The more she tried to fabricate violations, the easier it became to prove her corruption. Still, the harassment wore on him. Every day seemed to bring a new envelope, a new accusation, a new demand for payment. The HOA office mailbox became a weapon, its contents carefully crafted to grind him down. And while he meticulously documented each letter, photographing and filing them away, the constant barrage was exhausting. Neighbors began to notice. Some saw him snapping pictures of his lawn at odd hours, recording the positions of his trash cans, taking notes in a small logbook he carried. At first, they thought he was being obsessive. But when they learned why, their sympathy grew. They had seen Karen's tactics before, but never so relentless, never so personal. It was becoming harder for them to dismiss her behavior as mere rule enforcement. Karen, however, didn't stop there. She escalated further, weaponizing the tools of the HOA itself. She filed a community violation report against him, a formal document that could lead to legal action if left unchecked. She insisted that his continued resistance to paying fines was grounds for a lien against his property. For the first time, the threat was real if the board sided with her. She could legally attach penalties to his home, a move that would cost him far more than $500. The homeowner knew the stakes had risen. This wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. It was about protecting his home, his finances, and his reputation. But he also knew that Karen's desperation was her weakness. She was moving too quickly, making too many claims without evidence. And that meant he had a chance to turn her aggression into her downfall. He doubled down on his preparation. He contacted the neighbors who had given him testimonies and asked if they would be willing to speak directly to the board. To his surprise, several agreed. Years of frustration with Karen had built up, and now that someone else had taken the first step, they were ready to add their voices. One neighbor offered to provide video footage from their security camera, showing Karen photographing his lawn late at night. Another shared old letters she had kept, identical in tone and vagueness, proving a long history of false accusations. Piece by piece, the puzzle became undeniable. But Karen wasn't done fighting. She began spreading rumors that he was planning to sue the HOA, painting him as a threat to the entire community. She told allies that if he won, everyone's dues would increase, their property values would plummet, and chaos would follow. Fear was her last weapon, and she wielded it ruthlessly. Some neighbors grew wary, unsure who to believe. Others remained silent, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The neighborhood was divided, the tension thick enough to feel in the air. On morning walks, conversations would pause as he passed. At night, blinds would twitch as people peeked out, curious but unwilling to choose sides. Through it all, Karen maintained her facade of control. She walked the streets with her clipboard, her steps sharp and deliberate, her gaze scanning for imperfections. But underneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Her voice was sharper in meetings, her patience shorter, her mask of authority slipping little by little. The board, too, was feeling the strain. Each new complaint she filed required their attention, their time, their signatures. Some members began to question her motives privately, whispering doubts behind closed doors. The once united front was fracturing, and then came the breaking point. Karen filed a motion to fast-track a lien against his home, pushing the board to vote on it at the next meeting. It was her boldest move yet, a direct attempt to punish him financially, to crush his resistance once and for all. But what Karen didn't realize was that by forcing the issue into a formal vote, she had also forced the board to examine the evidence he had collected. She had walked straight into the trap she had set for him. The next meeting was no longer just a discussion. It would be a trial. A chance for the truth to be laid bare, for every accusation to be weighed against the facts. And this time, the homeowner wasn't walking in alone. He was walking in with allies. Neighbors who had been silent were ready to speak. Evidence that had been hidden was ready to be shown. Karen believed she was tightening the noose. But in reality, she was pulling the rope around her own neck. The stage was set for her greatest humiliation yet. The night of the board meeting arrived with a tension that wrapped around the neighborhood like a storm cloud. Word had spread quickly that this wasn't going to be a routine gathering. The agenda included Karen's motion to place a lien against the homeowner's property, a step so aggressive, so personal, that even residents who usually avoided drama wanted to witness the outcome. The clubhouse filled quickly. Folding chairs lined the walls, the air thick with whispers and speculation. Karen stood at the front, as she always did, clipboard in hand, dressed sharply, her chin raised in defiance. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked unshakable. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted across the room, scanning the faces, measuring loyalties, searching for cracks in the support she once commanded so easily. The homeowner arrived quietly, his folder once again under his arm. This time, he wasn't alone. Several neighbors followed him in, carrying papers, envelopes, even a laptop. They took their seats close to him, a silent but powerful statement. He wasn't just one man fighting against Karen anymore. He was the voice of everyone who had grown tired of her rule. The meeting began with the usual formalities. But no one was listening. Every eye was fixed on the single item that mattered, Karen's motion. She took the floor quickly, outlining her case with sharp precision. She painted the homeowner as non-compliant, disruptive, and dangerous to the integrity of the community. She waved a stack of violation notices as though their sheer volume was proof of guilt. Her words were confident, but her tone carried an edge of desperation. When she finished, silence lingered for a moment before the homeowner stood. Calmly, methodically, he began to lay out his defense. He opened his folder just as he had before, but this time he had more than documents. One by one, neighbors stood with him. The couple with the Christmas light fine, the family with the trash bin violation, the resident accused of noise while they were out of town. Each told their story, their voices steady but tinged with frustration. Some brought letters, some had photographs. One even held up a binder of fines they had paid just to avoid conflict. Then came the moment Karen hadn't anticipated. A neighbor stood up and produced video footage from their home security camera. The screen flickered as the recording played, showing Karen in the dead of night, photographing the homeowner's yard, pacing back and forth as if she were hunting for flaws. The image was clear, undeniable. It struck the room like a hammer. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's mask cracked. She attempted to dismiss the footage, claiming it was routine inspection, but the murmurs of disbelief around the room drowned her out. The homeowner then presented the stack of letters he had received, each baseless accusation meticulously documented. He pointed out how the bylaws required warnings before fines, how Karen had skipped procedures, how she had escalated without justification. He wasn't emotional, he wasn't theatrical, he was precise. His calmness only amplified the strength of his case by the time he finished. The pile of evidence on the table dwarfed Karen's clipboard. The weight of truth was visible, undeniable. The board was cornered. They couldn't ignore what was in front of them. One member spoke first, acknowledging the disturbing pattern of behavior. Another admitted they had long suspected Karen was overstepping but hadn't had proof until now. Slowly, the wall that had protected her began to crumble. Karen lashed out, her voice sharp, her words frantic. She accused the board of betrayal, the neighbors of conspiring, the homeowner of leading a witch hunt. Her composure was gone, replaced by raw panic. The more she shouted, the smaller her authority became. The vote came down swiftly after that. The motion to place a lien against the homeowner's property was denied unanimously. But it didn't stop there. The board announced that Karen's actions would be formally reviewed. Her leadership questioned, her position as president reconsidered. It was the first time she had ever been held accountable. The room erupted in murmurs, some relieved, some astonished. Neighbors exchanged glances, some even smiling quietly at the homeowner. For the first time in years, the grip Karen had on the community loosened. The homeowner sat back. His folder closed, the weight of victory settling over him. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was real. He had stood against Karen and won. Karen, however, didn't leave quietly. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her footsteps echoing in the silence she left behind. Her allies followed, faces pale, their loyalty shaken. The neighborhood had witnessed something they never thought possible. Karen had been challenged, and she had lost. But the story wasn't over. Karen still had her pride, her anger, and her desperate need for control. And as she disappeared into the night, everyone knew she wouldn't give up without one last fight. The board's decision had broken her authority, but it had also cornered her. And a cornered Karen was dangerous. The homeowner walked home under the glow of streetlights, his steps steady, his heart lighter. But deep down, he knew the final chapter of this war had yet to be written, because Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. The night of the board meeting had left the neighborhood buzzing. For the first time, Karen's power had been openly challenged and cracked in front of everyone. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into confidence. Neighbors who once walked on eggshells around her now felt a new freedom in their steps. But while the community was beginning to breathe easier, Karen herself was unraveling. The morning after the meeting, she returned to her routine with a vengeance. Clipboard in hand, she stalked the sidewalks, her eyes darting from mailbox to mailbox, lawn to lawn. But the effect was gone. Where once neighbors scrambled to hide, to fix, to comply, now they simply watched. Some shook their heads, others turned their backs. The silent obedience she had thrived on was gone, placed by a quiet defiance that grew stronger each day. Her retaliation continued. More letters appeared, stuffed into the homeowner's mailbox, accusing him of new violations. But this time, no one took them seriously. Neighbors knew the truth now. Each baseless letter became more fuel for the growing case against her. What she thought was intimidation was really self-destruction. The board, meanwhile, had begun its review. They requested copies of every complaint she had filed, every fine she had issued, every letter she had sent. What they uncovered was staggering. Dozens of violations issued without proper procedure, fines that contradicted the bylaws, threats that had no legal standing. Karen's pattern of abuse wasn't a few isolated incidents. It was the very foundation of her leadership. One by one, board members who had once supported her turned away. They couldn't defend her anymore. To do so would be to expose themselves to liability, to risk their own reputations. Karen had become a burden they no longer wanted to carry. At the next board meeting, the room was full again. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no fear. There was anticipation. The neighbors knew what was coming, and many came to witness it firsthand. Karen stood at the front once more, but her confidence was gone. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her eyes darted nervously. The clipboard that had once symbolized her authority now looked like a shield she was desperate to cling to. The board began with formal language, reciting their findings. They spoke of repeated abuse of power, failure to follow bylaws, and actions that had damaged the trust of the community. Each word was another crack in the fragile wall Karen had tried to rebuild since the last meeting. Finally, the announcement came. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs, followed by the quiet ripple of satisfaction from neighbors who had long dreamed of this moment. Karen's face went pale. For years, she had defined herself through control, through the authority of her title. Without it, she was just another resident. Another homeowner bound by the same rules she had once twisted at will. She tried to argue, to protest, but the words stumbled. The board cut her off gently, but firmly. Her reign was over. The homeowner sat quietly, watching the moment unfold. He didn't gloat, didn't cheer. He simply felt the weight of resolution. What had begun as a $500 fine had ended in the collapse of Karen's empire. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed. The tension lifted. Neighbors spoke more freely, waved more often, gathered without fear of being watched or fined. The air itself felt lighter, as though the community had been released from a grip it hadn't even realized was so tight. The homeowner continued his life as before, maintaining his lawn, paying his dues, living peacefully. But now when he passed neighbors on the street, he received more than nods. He received gratitude. Quiet thanks for standing up, for refusing to bend, for doing what so many had been too afraid to do. Karen, meanwhile, retreated. She still lived in the neighborhood, but her presence was diminished. She no longer patrolled the streets with her clipboard. She no longer dictated rules with her sharp tone. Without the power of the title, she was just Karen, a reminder of what happens when control turns into obsession. The $500 fine had never been about money. It had been about power, intimidation, and control. But in trying to enforce it, Karen had lost everything. Her tactics, her reputation, her presidency all crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. And so, the story ended not with a single moment of triumph, but with a quiet victory that spread through the neighborhood like sunlight breaking through clouds. The HOA had been restored, the community had been freed, and one homeowner's refusal to back down had changed everything. For Karen, it was regret. For the neighbors, it was relief. And for the homeowner, it was proof that sometimes the only way to beat a bully is to stand your ground, document the truth, wait for their empire to collapse under its own weight. The war was over. The chapter closed. And the neighborhood finally could move on. Weeks turned into months, and the echoes of Karen's downfall still lingered in the neighborhood. What had once been a community ruled by fear and constant surveillance had slowly transformed into something far more peaceful. The change was subtle at first, a neighbor planting flowers without worrying about a violation, kids riding bikes without being told to stay quiet, families setting up lawn chairs in their front yards to enjoy warm evenings without glancing nervously down the street. But the longer Karen stayed silent, the stronger the community grew. The board elected a new president, someone known for fairness and cooperation rather than control. Meetings became less about punishment and more about problem solving. The HOA, once a tool for Karen's dominance, began to serve its true purpose, maintaining order without strangling freedom. Karen, however, couldn't escape the shadow of her own reputation. She still lived in the neighborhood, but her presence had shrunk. Neighbors who once avoided her now passed her without acknowledgement. Conversations would hush when she walked by. The power she had once wielded through intimidation had evaporated, leaving only isolation. For Karen, the silence was unbearable. Without her title, without her clipboard, she had no audience for her authority. Her attempts to regain relevance, suggesting new rules, nitpicking small details, cornering board members with advice, were politely dismissed. She was no longer the voice of power, but the echo of what had been. The homeowner, on the other hand, thrived in the new environment. His home became a quiet symbol of resilience, a reminder that standing firm against injustice could create lasting change. Neighbors often stopped him during evening walks, sharing their gratitude or their own stories of times they had stayed quiet out of fear. Now, they were free to speak. But Karen's regret ran deeper than anyone could see. She replayed the meetings in her mind, the moment the video exposed her. The board's decision to remove her, the sound of her authority collapsing in front of her neighbors. She had believed for years that control equaled respect, that fear equaled order. Now, all she had left was the sting of humiliation. The ultimate irony was that Karen had been the author of her own downfall. No one had forced her to issue those fake fines. No one had told her to stalk yards at night or bend rules until they broke. Her obsession with control had blinded her, and in the end, it had destroyed her. Seasons changed. The once dense community flourished in its freedom. Block parties returned. Decorations filled yards during the holidays without fear of reprimand. Children's laughter echoed in the cul-de-sacs without angry letters threatening fines. The neighborhood, once divided, now felt like a place people were proud to call home. And Karen? She remained in her house, curtains often drawn, her presence fading into the background. She was still there, a permanent reminder of what happens when power is abused. But she no longer had the strength to fight. and the community no longer gave her the attention she craved. The story that began with a $500 fine ended with something far greater: the restoration of balance, the reclaiming of a neighborhood spirit, and the quiet justice of watching a bully become irrelevant. For the homeowner, life moved forward. He had one not just for himself, but for everyone. And though Karen might never admit her regret out loud, the silence around her house spoke louder than any clipboard or letter ever could. The war was over. The community was free. And the name Karen had become less a title of power and more a cautionary tale. Time dulled the intensity of Karen's downfall, but it didn't erase her bitterness. Though she had lost her presidency and the respect of her neighbors, she still carried the same sharp edge, the same hunger for control. For months, she stayed quiet, watching from the shadows of her drawn curtains, plotting silently while the neighborhood flourished without her. But Karen was never built for silence. She thrived on confrontation, on being at the center of attention, on holding a clipboard like a crown. And when whispers began to circulate that the new HOA president was too lenient and too relaxed, Karen saw her chance. She started small, attending board meetings again, this time not at the front, but in the audience. She'd raise her hand politely, making comments about declining standards, pointing out grass an inch too long, or paint fading on garage doors. She framed her words carefully, disguising criticism as concern for the community. Some nodded, uneasy but willing to listen. Others rolled their eyes, remembering all too well what her leadership had meant. Next, Karen began sending emails to the board. Long, detailed messages filled with suggestions, rule clarifications, and policy reminders. She tried to flood the system with her presence, to reestablish herself as the authority figure she once was. But the new board had learned from the past. They replied with short, professional answers never giving her the attention or power she craved. When subtlety failed, Karen escalated. She began walking the neighborhood again, this time without her clipboard but with her phone, snapping photos of what she deemed violations. Trash cans left out too long. A swing set painted a color she thought clashed. A holiday decoration she insisted was too early. She sent the photos to the board with long captions, expecting action, but the board didn't act. They ignored her nitpicking, choosing instead to focus on genuine issues that actually mattered. And that's when Karen grew frustrated. Her resentment boiled over in whispered conversations with the few neighbors still willing to entertain her. She spun stories of community decline, warning of what would happen if someone responsible didn't step up. Slowly, she tried to rebuild a base of support, one complaint at a time, yet every attempt backfired. Neighbors remembered her reign, the sleepless nights, the constant fines, the sense of being watched. They had lived under her control once, and they weren't eager to return. Each time she spoke, someone would remind her of the past. Each time she complained, someone else would roll their eyes. Still, Karen refused to give up. She decided her comeback would not be through influence alone, it would be through drama. At the next board meeting, she stood up, her voice loud, her words sharp. She accused the new leadership of failing the community, of letting standards slip, of turning the neighborhood into chaos. She demanded a vote of confidence, claiming residents deserved better, but the room didn't rally behind her. Instead, it grew colder. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, some even laughing quietly. Her words, once sharp enough to cut, now fell flat. The board president calmly thanked her for her input, then moved to the next item on the agenda without acknowledging her outburst further. That simple dismissal cut deeper than any public argument could have. Karen walked out of the meeting with her head high, but her chest hollow. For the first time, she realized the truth. Her reign was not coming back. Her neighbors didn't fear her anymore. They didn't even take her seriously. The homeowner who had once been her greatest target watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. He no longer needed to fight Karen. She was fighting herself, trapped in the wreckage of her own reputation. What, Karen thought would be her comeback, had instead become her final act of desperation. And in that moment, the neighborhood understood something important. Karen's power had never truly been in the rules. The fines or the HOA title? It had always been in the silence of those who let her get away with it. Now, with that silence broken forever, Karen's voice was nothing more than noise.